Do you ever look at that woman standing on the corner and wonder what she's thinking? Then you should read Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And before we get to the review, we're going to answer one question. Did I enjoy reading this book? And the answer is no. Welcome to Whiskey and Literature, where we read and discuss the greatest books of all time. And while we're turning those pages, we're sipping those bottles, those finely distilled spirits. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. This is my 13th book review of the year, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And before we get to the book, let's talk about the author. Virginia Woolf, English author. Born in 1882, she struggled with mental illness her entire life and committed suicide in 1941 by drowning herself in a river. She is considered one of the greatest authors of the 20th century, and I have two of her novels to read this year, this one and To the Lighthouse. She was born into a non-religious family and was considered a humanist. Woolf was a critic of Christianity. She gave a scathing denunciation regarding it as self-righteous egotism. There are no gods, no one to blame. And so she developed this atheist religion where we do good for the sake of goodness. She had several affairs with women and said that she characterizes Clarissa, the main character of Mrs. Dalloway. Before we get to the book, one mention of the whiskey of the week, Angel's Envy, finished rye. Rye whiskey finished in rum cask. I no longer long form review the whiskey of the weeks in my book reviews, but look for this review to drop this coming Wednesday. And once it does, the link to that video will be in the comment section below. Okay, let's get to the specs and stats of Mrs. Dalloway. It was first published in 1925. And remember, it began its life as two separate stories that were blended into one. The story takes place in one day of the life of Mrs. Dalloway, and it pioneered the use of stream of consciousness, where we see her thoughts and feelings throughout the day. This is thought to be a response to James Joyce's Ulysses, which is my number 2 book of the year. So we'll get to that review in December. And while Virginia Woolf initially praised Ulysses, she ultimately rejected it. I didn't listen to this book at all on Audible. And the copy that I have comes in at 198 pages long, and I paid $3 for it at the Goodwill bookstore. And interestingly enough, there are no chapter breaks in this book at all. It's just one big, long story. Okay, plot, structure, and characters. Clarissa Dalloway, a 51-year-old Englishwoman, wife of a dignitary. And she's hosting a party this evening, and we follow her throughout the day as she goes around London getting things ready for the party. As she walks around London, she's reminded of her youth and the choices that she's made. She married stalwart Richard Dalloway instead of the demanding and explosive Peter Walsh. And she, and quote, had not the option to be with Sally Seton romantically. Peter Walsh arrives in London on this day and reignites these thoughts. Septimus Smith, a World War I veteran suffering from PTSD, spends the day at the park with his wife and is seen by Peter Walsh. Septimus suffers from frequent hallucinations of his old war buddy Evans, who was killed in the war. He is involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital later in the day, and rather than be taken, he commits suicide. Clarissa and Septimus never meet, but his suicide becomes a topic of conversation at her party. At first, Clarissa is annoyed that people at her party are talking about this death, but then she eventually grows to admire his act. In the introduction to the 1928 printing of this novel, Virginia Woolf explicitly states that Septimus Smith is to be interpreted as Clarissa Dalloway's double. Another time, she explained that Clarissa was herself, pretty much exposing its duality that she herself felt. And remember, she did commit suicide. There's almost no dialogue in this novel except for internal thoughts and feelings. This is a common tactic or strategy used by authors, but I've never seen it used to this extent. I just finished The Red and the Black, And it does use this device, this inner dialogue, but it not nearly to the extent that it is in Mrs. Dalloway. Some of the themes in this book are mental illness, time, homosexuality, feminism, and secular living. Okay, so what are my thoughts on Mrs. Dalloway? Honestly, I'm really conflicted on this book. Is it okay for me to say that as more time passes, the more glad I am to have read this book? But I didn't necessarily enjoy reading it. Maybe a combination of no chapter breaks and frequent changes in who was thinking at that moment and what the scene was lessened my appreciation. I think presenting the story and the characters in this manner was an inventive and novel approach to storytelling. And honestly, the book is small enough that maybe I'll give it another go in a few years to see if I still feel the same way. And unfortunately, it hasn't really heightened my anticipation for her next novel that's coming up in a few months. Okay, on to the star rating. I judge all books by 5 criteria. And if you have any thoughts or suggestions, drop them in the comments section below. Let's go through this. First, initial response. How did I feel as soon as I finished the book? And I'm going to give Mrs. Dalloway a 2 because I was mostly just happy that it was over. Okay, recommendation. How likely am I to recommend this book? And I'm going to give it a 3 because I think there are a few people who might enjoy this book that I know. 3. Did I enjoy the writing style? And I'm going to give it a 3 because I'm still processing this stream of consciousness thing, and it was a fairly slow novel. 4. Plot and structure. How engaged was I in the story? And I'm going to give it a 4 because I enjoy the interconnectedness of the few storylines and how they were woven together but never actually touched. And 5. Characters. Were they relatable, believable, and engaging? And I'm also going to give it a 4 because they were relatable, certainly, and believable. I'll give them that. And Audible, number 6, I didn't listen to it at all on Audible. So that's a total of 19, and 19 divided by 5 is 3.8. So 3.8 stars for Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And honestly, that's higher than I thought it was going to get. Thanks for sticking with me. In the description is the links to my other reviews. If you enjoyed the content, like the video. It's free. Subscribe to see more of my content. Guys, I hope you're reading something good and drinking something great. Turn the pages, my friends, and stay thirsty. Cheers.